Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate the invite and I'm so glad to be with you today. Um, I'm going to be talking about justice and evaluation. And as Teresa mentioned, I happily welcome comments and questions as we go in the chat or raising your hand, and hope that this can be a bit more of a conversation, and hopefully we'll also have time for some discussion and questions at the end as well. So I'll begin by introducing myself. One thing about me is that I love sunrises and sunsets and being outdoors. And so this represents Lake Michigan, not far from where I grew up and my family now. So I grew up in Michigan. I went for my bachelor's to a small private liberal arts Kelvin College, now Kelvin University. And David and I share alum status from there. So we've had lots of conversations about that experience in relation to other walks of life. I then left being close to Lake Michigan and went to the fields of Central Illinois University of Urbana-Champaign, the cornfields, and studied there in educational psychology, which is where I got my PhD. And I will say, my time at Kelvin, I always like to tell these stories because I think it's helpful for students to know, like, what's the career trajectory? How did you land where you landed? At Kelvin, I was an undergraduate in psychology. And I had an internship where I worked at the local hospital in a collaboration doing community-based research. There was a randomized control trial of a community health program. And I worked with community researchers going out into homes and interviewing women and kids and doing assessments of their young children, and also helping the hospital and community think about how do we use this evidence to affect and make changes in services. And I fell in love with doing that. And so when I went on to grad school, I focused a lot on evaluation, but was in a program situated in a school of education. And so there was involved more with evaluation of professional development programs for teachers and staff, as well as curriculum or learning programs and initiatives in schools. And I know advice I got when I went to graduate school was find the one topic that you are passionate about and become the expert in that one topic. And at the time when I was given that advice from a wise mentor, I thought, I don't know that I want to go to grad school then. How could I focus my whole life on one topic? But I made both happen, and that's what I value about my work as a methodologist and an evaluator, is that I can take up a variety of topics and interests and see how they intersect. I then started at Loyola, so I've been here almost 15 years now as a faculty member in the School of Education in the research methodology area. So we have a PhD and MA program. Many of our students, though, take courses from across the School of Education and across the school. Over the years, I've had nursing students, criminal justice, social work, sociology, a variety, pastoral studies, law, across the social disciplines and professions that take courses. I teach courses in evaluation, qualitative research, and mixed methods research. And while I've been here, I've been doing a lot of also continuing work in evaluating professional development programs and other community-based programs. I appreciate the Jesuit institution here. I am not Jesuit or Catholic, but very close, the other kind of larger Catholic, but do think that faith informs much of my work. And then in terms of my professional home, although I've been to a variety of different organizations, and so on in terms of presenting and collaborating with other people. But where I sort of see a professional home is in the American Evaluation Association and field in terms of doing evaluation work. So that's a bit about me. And it's helpful if I have a little sense of you and brought you here today. So if you have a disciplinary home or a reason that was of interest, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat, and then I know to start kind of who we have and where the interest might be. Great, sociology. Yes, of course, Curl does lots of evaluation. Yes, school psych, great. I have a whole section of school psych people taking program evaluation right now. Yes, faculty work, we do evaluation definitely at Loyola. Wonderful. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention public policy too. Lots of students in public policy taking courses with me. Social psychology, yes, part of my roots. Wonderful, and lots of assessment work in higher ed and accreditation. Yeah, sometimes the vocabulary we use is different, but we're really talking about the same things. Yep. Wonderful, and I'm glad we have a diverse audience here too. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. That helps me know how best to have our conversation and time together as well. I'm going to be talking about today. Can get mouse clicking again. There we go. So we're going to talk about what is evaluation, since we come from different places, or it might be completely new. And I've intentionally put evaluation because sometimes we forget that the word value is embedded within that word. And a few years ago, I did a ed talk through the School of Education where I called it evaluation, putting the value back in evaluation, because it's often something that we don't talk about. And so that's largely a focus of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to give an example from practice. Given that this was recording and there's issues with clients, this will be a little different talk for me, that it's more theoretical and conceptual, but I will ground that with an example. But I'm not going to share a ton of examples today, but we had talked about at the end, if there's time to talk, and we can pause the recording, that we can talk more about that later in Q&A. And then really want to focus on how is justice understood in evaluation theory and practice. So first, we're going to take up this idea of evaluation and what is it? And I'll start with this image, which I'll be honest with you, sometimes when I go into schools and communities, this is who they assume that I am when I walk into the room. And I've even had people say to me after working for a while, I'm like, you don't seem like an evaluator. Like, sort of, I didn't fit their profile of the Grim Reaper. And perhaps some of you have had that experience as well, whether you're in that role of evaluation and assume you're taking on that role, or you've been on the other receiving end and felt like evaluation was that. But maybe you can just throw in the chat sort of what thoughts or images come up for you, or concerns that you see in that image in terms of understanding of evaluation. Yes, they have bad news, so it's negative. There's nothing positive about the experience, right? So that creates fear. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. So it's obviously an extremely negative, right, perception and image, misunderstanding. And a lot of the work that I do is trying to resituate this image of evaluation so that it's not experienced as that. So one of the concerns that I see that this image represents that sometimes can happen in evaluation is that the evaluator in this situation has all the power. Those stakeholders there don't really seem to have much control of the situation. And the stakeholders are really in a passive role. They're right, they can't really do much. And so this doesn't create a good dynamic. Now, hopefully humorous, and I'm glad some people put in the chat, not my experience at all with evaluation. And I'm very glad about that. And so we can talk about some of those things. This might be a more common way that evaluation is some sort of inquiry cycle or process that is centered on stakeholders and diverse groups of stakeholders that have different perspectives. So we may start by preparation, determining who those stakeholders are and how they ought to be involved in the process. Talk about identifying assumptions and different perspectives, the context in which we're working, what the initiative is, the theory behind that, and then think about developing a plan for evaluating it. What are the important questions to ask? What are measures, ways we want to represent the experiences? Then collect and analyze the data, communicate that out so that people understand, can utilize that, and then make informed decisions, work on improving action, affecting social change, and then we cycle through again. And so it's much more of a dynamic, collaborative process. And I know from working with Curl that that's much more aligned with work and perspective there. We sometimes think about there's a really blurry line between research and evaluation. So what is the difference? And this is one possible way that there's distinctions, although people, I also think this is a bit of an oversimplification, but sometimes a researcher will say, you know, I produce knowledge. It's not up to me to decide and make value judgments around what that means, right? Policymakers do that, the public does that, the reader does that, but I generate the evidence, objective evidence, and provide that. where an evaluator says, well, I can make value judgments, because that is essential in the task of evaluating. It's not just enough to generate knowledge, but to help think about how from that knowledge do we then make decisions about actions, make recommendations, decide this initiative is heading in a good direction that is beneficial for the community, or this initiative is not and changes are needed. This initiative is supporting faculty in their well-being, or is supporting students, or this is not, or here's changes we need to make. And so an evaluator is very much in a role of taking the evidence that's generated and helping make those value judgments. The irony, though, is that we don't often talk about that in the process of doing evaluation. And just as a little background, when I teach evaluation, this is a metaphor I draw on that the field has talked about. Christie and Elkin started this as a way to sort of organize different theoretical approaches to evaluation in the field, and many of these have developed in different social milieux over time. And so I think even today we're seeing changes in how data and evidence are used in the midst of the COVID pandemic. I don't know how many of you might watch dashboards of data of what the numbers are doing, and that maybe helps you make decisions about where I'm going out or what I'm doing, for example. But that is an evaluative task. And, we're in a new age that evidence can be readily available in ways that it hasn't in the past. But this tree highlights some main sort of emphases in evaluation. And all of these areas matter, just different theoretical approaches over the years have emphasized things differently. So there's a whole branch in evaluation focused more on methods. So how do I design a quasi-experimental design? How do I mix methods? How do I come up with causal inferences? And so this branch is much more focused on those technical elements of coming up with claims from evidence. Right? Another branch sort of developed a bit in reaction to that sort of said, we did all these evaluations over the years, but now they're just collecting dust on the shelf. No one's using them. So what is the value in that? And so then there were theorists that came out and focused more on, okay, how do we do evaluation in collaborative manners? How do we work with stakeholders, involve them in the process? So that they have buy-in and they're using and feel invested. And so that inquiry cycle I showed you is an example of a process that helps facilitate that use of evidence. And then there has been a branch that has said, wait, what's central in evaluation is this task of valuing, what that last comic got at. And while Elkin and Christie kind of kept these branches together, Mertens and Wilson and Adma later came out along and said, well, actually, I think there is a bit of a distinction, and that there is this task of valuing, but there's also this branch of approaches in evaluation that centers justice and equity as a value. And those are somewhat distinct, and wanted to highlight that. In a very concrete way, these different theoretical approaches inform how we interact with people in the process of doing evaluation. And so in a methods branch, one of the thoughts is that social relations are irrelevant to or a source of error in evaluation work. So I shouldn't start to develop relationships with stakeholders, because then that might bias me. And so that affects how you interact. In the use branch, social relations should be managed. So there's a lot of role in the evaluator to build rapport, negotiate, resolve conflicts, but it's all in an effort to sort of manage those and keep those relationships healthy so that they're using the evidence. In the valuing branch, there's more of a focus on that social relations are the point. And this is a fundamental shift, that part of what we're doing in evaluation is modeling a way of interacting with one another, and that those relationships become the point of the work. And then in the social justice branch, that social relations should be changed, because in this branch and theoretical perspective, there's attention to power and privilege and oppression, aware that system and structures create oppression and marginalization. And so part of the task of the evaluation is actually to help shift those power imbalances and relationships in the evaluation work. So when we are doing evaluative work and making value judgments, how we go about making those value judgments can be quite different. And in the field, theorists have talked about them in different ways. So one way of thinking about making a value judgment is more of an objective approach, which the top image represents, right? There's some way to measure what success or efficiency or effectiveness looks like, and we measure that. And that could be, it usually is more quantitative data and evidence. There is also a sense in which there is a subjective notion of valuing. And this is not meant to be like just someone's opinion or anecdotal evidence, but that it is rooted in something meaningful. And a great example I find is when my family watches cooking shows. Does anyone else like to watch cooking shows? So this is an older one, but these kids are so cute. I just love to watch this. So we're going to watch one of these together, but I'm going to fast forward it. And what I want you to think about is the interaction that happens, what evidence comes to play, what judgments are made, and in that interaction, is that valuing that judgment appreciated, assumed it's of value? All right, so I think it's great.
Now, what kind of cupcakes did you make? I made a chocolate cupcake with peanut butter cups and a peanut butter cream cheese frosting, garnished with a chocolate heart, chocolate balls, and mini peanut butter cups. Okay. Love the little chocolate heart. You made that for yourself, right? Yes, ma'am. Now, there's a little peanut butter cup there. It has peanut butter cups in the batter. This is good. That cream cheese peanut butter frosting is delicious. It's nutty, it's sweet. Now, I think I would have liked more frosting and to have it be thicker so it could stand up and hold its shape a little bit more. I think the peanut butter cups in the batter weighs the batter down just a bit, but really nice job, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you. Yours are squish too.
All right. So what do you notice about this interaction? And I will say too, for me, a parallel in doing evaluation is that, she judged the cupcake because she experienced it, right? She looked at it, she sliced it, she ate it, and then she could give a sense of that. And so this is much more of a qualitative approach where I might go and do participant observation. I go and I talk to community members, but I somehow, put myself in the shoes. I experience it. And as someone experiencing it, then I gain knowledge about what it is. Yeah, and she did get input. That's a great point, right? So it was done in a communal setting, right? So that others can interact and see what's going on. And obviously, the adult judge is viewed as an expert. She has established herself as a renowned baker. And so that's of value. And that matters. And that's something else to think about. And sometimes why people have experience when the evaluator comes in, they're not valued because they don't see that they have a background and experience and expertise that would put them in a position, right, to be sharing what they're doing. All right, so different ways we can think about valuing. Something else that's essential when we engage in evaluation is coming up with criteria of how we decide. So with the cupcake, things like it's sweet, it's moist, the consistency, right? These are all criteria that we use to make judgments on that quality. Now, if I would say I am gluten-free, judging that cupcake becomes different for me, right? So the criteria matter and they change the judgment around what something is. And so part of this, when we come to evaluation work and we're working with stakeholders and talking about assumptions, do we talk about the criteria that we are making value judgments on? And so what's listed here is some common ones that Schwant has talked about in the field of evaluation. Like sometimes we start with what are the objectives, or maybe a community needs assessment was done. And so we know these are the needs. So now when we roll out an initiative or policy, we're going to see, are those needs addressed? Or we created this educational curriculum. It has these objectives. We're going to see if these objectives are met. And those become criteria. Sometimes we look at effectiveness, what kind of outcome or impact it has, however that may be defined. Sometimes we look at efficiency. Was it cost effective for what we're trying to do? The relevance at the particular time for the particular community. Was it sustainable? So after sort of initial setup or initial investment of resources, is it something that could continue? Or once those resources and supports remove, is it not sustainable? Or in the process of working on this program, is there attention to environmental sustainability? And is that addressed? Or are resources used in a way that it perpetuates those issues and concerns? Cultural relevance and responsiveness. So oftentimes interventions or policies are developed for one community and then transposed, right, for another, and just assume that if it works in this place, it will work over here as well. And so we can look at, is that relevant? Is it a good cultural fit? established requirements sometimes there's mandated changes out of legislation. So are you meeting those mandates or are you not meeting those mandates? Expert opinion, again, cupcake judging is an example of that, but we can think about that in the policy realm as well. And then today I wanted to focus on, in particular, justice as a criteria that we might use when judging and thinking about the value of a particular program or initiative. And sometimes people use other words like equity, public good, and so on. And obviously those are distinct. Being situated at Loyola, I am intentionally using justice here. So why justice? Why does it matter? House, who I'll talk about later a bit more, Ernest House, mentions that evaluation is as good or as bad as the value framework that constrains it. So in other words, what we decide in terms of how we carry it out and how we make those judgments is only as good as the values that we have. All right, any questions or thoughts before I move on to the next part?
Just a reminder that folks can type in the chat, but I think Leanne, you're okay if they want to unmute themselves and lob out a question. Just know that you're going to appear on camera on the recording if you do. So.
Yep, great. All right, so just want to move on to justice. And when I'm talking about a value of justice, I'm talking about it as like those criteria. It's almost like an end goal that we are aiming for. So to what purpose or in whose interest should evaluation practice be conducted? So it's a guide not only for programs, initiatives, and policies, but also the practice of evaluation itself. This is a common definition of social justice that is used in, I know some of the courses in the School of Education, I'm sure other places on campus from Bell, Adams, and Griffith, but what I want to highlight here is that you'll see italicized text and bold text that I have in this definition. That there's full equal participation of all groups that mutually shape their needs, that there's a distribution of resources equitably, and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. There's a sense of individuals being self-determining and also interdependent, sense of their own agency, and also a sense of social responsibility. And why I want to draw out that is it helps me think about different conceptions of justice. And I am not a philosopher or humanities person by training, but do like to draw on it to help inform my thinking. So there may be others in the audience that are better situated for this work than I am, and I've drawn on some of those colleagues. Two scholars that I've drawn on is Nicholas Waltersdorf, who's a philosopher by training, and Nancy Fraser Turner, who's a political theorist and philosopher. And both of them have written extensively about justice, and both talk about kind of different ways of conceptualizing justice. So Nicholas Waltersdorf talks about justice as a right order in society, but also talks about justice as natural rights for all human beings. So, and Nancy Fraser Turner talks about justice as a redistribution of resources and also justice as recognition. And so going back to that other definition, what we see here is sort of this idea of natural rights and recognition, in the sense of like rights are innate in people, right? And it's what grows out of initiatives around human rights, and that's an understanding. And so justice is recognizing those rights we just by being human beings. The sense of right order and redistribution is that idea of distributing resources equitably, that there's shared similar access. And so I mention these because these help give me a lens through thinking about how we practice evaluation and what we actually mean when we're talking about justice. So I'm going to give an example with Arrupe College, and I don't think, unless someone has joined, do we have any Arrupe staff, alum, current or former students? No, I don't think so. All right. Well, hopefully many of you at least are aware of Arrupe, and I will start by saying I'm not going to talk specifically about an evaluation, but more what was learned from the experience. And that this work is going to be based on work that I did with some evaluation classes in the first initial years that Arrupe started. And so it may not be relevant anymore. This is well pre-pandemic, and they're also in a different space in terms of being more established, and that changes things. And so know that I'm not speaking to current day Arrupe, and I just want to make sure that that is clear as well. So for those of you, hopefully you are familiar, but for those of you not, Arrupe is a separate school on Loyola's campus. And in a nutshell, you know, I think a tension exists between our institutional mission and who has access and can afford a Loyola education due to the cost of tuition. And so Arrupe was partly born out of that to give students an opportunity for a 2-year associate's degree and then to transfer on for a bachelor's either at Loyola or at another institution, and also to be able to hopefully get out of college debt-free, at least with their associate's degree. And so when it started, there were approximately 300 Chicago area students that were predominantly underrepresented in higher education, including undocumented students, first generation African American, Latina. And they could get their arts and humanities, business, social and behavioral science associate's degrees. Their commuter campus, small class sizes, right? Lots of supports for students. And again, has been a model that other Jesuit institutions have now adopted. And with students in my class, we collaborated with faculty and students at Arrupe over a few semesters to carry out evaluations, not of the overall Arrupe model, that's too much in a one semester to take on, but just a little piece that was important for them at that time. And so what I want to share with you is conversations we had in courses. Is Arrupe College a just program? So if we think about justice as a value that we make value judgments based on, is it a just program? And how can we utilize evidence from the evaluation to help us look at that? And what I want to talk through is some of the sort of conversations that we had and things that we noticed as we looked at it. So Arrupe College is addressing injustices of distribution in terms of giving access, and different semesters we interviewed Arrupe students and they were overwhelmingly grateful for the opportunity to receive their associate's degree debt-free. and frequently sort of even gave the caveat, like, I wouldn't have this opportunity if this did not exist. So the sense of it gave access happened. Urupe accepted and supported dreamers who are undocumented, and wouldn't have access to financial aid in other ways. At the same time, students noted that some students are turned away. It's not like a community college where it's open access, they're selective. So I think they had figured out data that the acceptance rate was 78%. I think it was that first year. And it also doesn't guarantee a 2-year or 4-year degree. I think it was in their first graduating class, 51% of the students had associate's degrees, which was much higher than a community college rate, but still not everyone. And it was a limited number of students were able to transfer to Loyola. In 2019, there was 12 Arupe alumni that graduated. And then there was also some limits on what students could do. So some students came and wanted to be in professional programs like nursing, and there was no way starting at Arupe to do that in 4 years. I know there's different pathways now working out, and there's continued effort to expand professional pathways for students. We also encountered students who had been accepted at both Loyola and Arupe and had to make a decision about which to attend and what implications that had for them. And in some sense, they still felt like Loyola is not an option, even though I got accepted, because financially I can't afford it. And what does that mean to them? So in other words, there are elements of distribution of resources here in terms of access to education. There's also elements of the sense of what students deserve, what is right owed to them, and how to respect them. So I don't necessarily have answers. The point is more, how do we raise these issues in evaluation practice? How does these kinds of value conversations around justice become an everyday part of evaluation activities? And so just want to walk through a few theories and thinking, and then we'll wrap it up and open it up for questions. So some of my thinking, I draw on a mentor, Jennifer Green, and when she talks about these different theories of evaluation, she talks about that they affect both the macro positioning of evaluation in society, the role evaluation plays, as well as the micro positioning of evaluation in relationships every day. And so how I choose to interact with stakeholders, engage in a meeting, share evaluation findings are also informed. So these theoretical approaches address those kinds of issues, and it's important to be thinking at both levels. So what I want to walk through is 3 different theories and approaches, and then sort of connect it back to these conceptions of justice. So one common one by House, who I mentioned earlier, and there's been others, but draw on sort of political theories of democracy to think about how we do evaluation. So House's deliberative democratic evaluation involves inclusion, dialogue, and deliberation. So the task is to identify all the stakeholders and ensure that they are included in the evaluation, no matter where their positions in power is. So often in evaluation, a client who gets to make the most decisions, who is funding the project, can have the most sort of power at a table, but how do we involve a wide range of stakeholders in the process? And then that we have dialogue around those perspectives, experiences, and that dialogue in and of itself is an evaluative activity and engagement. So we saw an example of that in the cupcake instance, right? Like evaluation is happening in that conversation. So, and obviously we bring data we collect to the table to do that, but that dialogue matters. And it's a process of negotiating understanding and negotiating value judgments. And in this approach, there is an assumption that we can reach some sort of consensus, whatever that may mean, through a deliberative process. Now, in practice, what we've seen is that this is really hard to carry out. It's really hard to get people from multiple perspectives, logistically even, around a table, have good, meaningful dialogue and deliberation. And in our current context, that even seems much more difficult to do. And so often evaluators practicing say, well, I love this in theory. I'm not quite sure what this means in practice. And it puts a very different role of the evaluator, that the evaluator is in a position of negotiating those conversations. So helping address the power imbalances of the people that are around the table. And that takes a very different kind of skill set than, for example, collecting data and analyzing data. So what I would say is that this approach resembles more of a distribution of rights, in that it's a distribution of being able to involve and participate in that dialogue. There's some sense of that recognition and right, but it's mostly a distribution of opportunity to participate. Donna Mertens and others have talked about more ideological based evaluation. So builds off a variety of different approaches in feminist, critical race, queer, or indigenous theories. In these approaches, there's much more attention to the unequal power relationships and seeing strength in communities. In practice, this fits very much with that social justice branch, that part of evaluation work is to change those power imbalances. And so by the kinds of questions that we ask, who we involve in our process, who data gets shared with, can help address those unequal powers and build strength in communities. And many of these approaches are much more rooted in a sense of rights, right? That people in communities, those that are marginalized, have rights to be respected in the same way as those in positions of power. And then another one, similar to the ideological base, but culture responsive approaches have been largely rooted in scholars, US-based African-American scholars in evaluation, that recognize that power and privilege is very much embedded in culture, in the norms, right? The dominant norms. And so evaluation is there to address marginalization and oppression in similar manners as in the ideologically based approaches. But that there is attention to understanding culture in the context and responding accordingly. So again, we see some evidence of justice as distribution and perhaps justice as recognition in these approaches. But perhaps we could benefit by how can we think of these together that in our theories that direct us, we have both attention to distribution and recognition. This is where I feel like this is an ongoing life's work. So these are just Leanne's initial musings based on different projects that I have done over the years. That what do I find beneficial as I'm trying to do this work and practice evaluation with this kind of attention to justice. And so I have a few, and I'm hoping we can open up to conversation for others. So the first is that the work of the evaluator in developing criteria to make value judgments, one, that you're doing that work, and two, that it's a process of determining what natural rights matter in that particular setting, and how things are distributed, and then helping promote and ensure that. So there's good examples of, for example, international development programs that maybe uphold an evaluation. The UN's document of child rights, right? In terms of providing a focus for how we judge the quality of initiatives and policies we have in place. There's a role of the evaluator in moral listening, understanding these different perspectives, listening for what matters to people, what rights are important, how to respect each other. The importance of participatory processes and approaches, that you're supporting agency among stakeholders, addressing power imbalances that exist in the setting when you show up. And that in doing the work, generating stories of hope. So some of what I do, and largely because I think I gravitate towards qualitative methods, is doing a lot of case studies of, okay, we often working in very complex settings, difficult problems that no one's ever going to solve. But where can we find cases of where there's possibility that this is working, sort of these little nuggets of opportunity and hope, and how can we study and understand those and share those back to create a vision for, where others can go, and doing that kind of work rather than monitoring effectiveness, and how we might change that sort of vision of a grim reaper going from where we started is if we all understood evaluators as people who practice, this task of helping work with people to identify, stories of hope and cases for possibility, a vision for the future of where we want to be, as the work that is being done together collaboratively. Those are some references, but with that, I will open it up to questions and comments, and yeah, love to hear from your experiences. Yeah, Jill.
Yeah, I'm surprised in your review of the justice literature that you focused on distributive justice and not procedural justice as well, which is another of the major strands of justice research and literature over the years, theoretical and practical. Certainly in terms of talking about, participation and recognition of multiple stakeholders and so forth, that brings those procedural factors in, and so perhaps you're just using other terminology for that. But in recognizing the equal human dignity of everyone, not just the clients who have asked for an evaluation, but that everyone who is involved in the situation that's being evaluated, the procedures then that are engaged in to do the evaluation, that recognize everyone's input and the values that everyone has and the stakes that they have in the situation, that everyone has a voice, that participation that you spoke to. I just would commend to your attention the rich literature in procedural justice as well as distributive justice.
Yeah, great. No, I think that is an excellent point, and I really appreciate that. And you're also reminding me something else I meant to mention and didn't, is a graduate student colleague that's working with me is interested in Indigenous approaches to evaluation and has done reading in the work around in Indigenous communities around justice as healing, and what those conceptions of justice are and the implications that has in evaluation context as well. So yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that. And yeah, if you have any names of people to read, I'd be happy to. It might be a semantics. I wonder if House and House work does draw on that. I know they draw a lot on Rawls' theory of justice. So is Rawls considered procedural justice? I'm guessing somewhat, a little bit. No.
I mean, it both in political philosophy and in just philosophy per se. I mean, it's a huge field.
Right, I know it is. And that's the work that I don't do and I can't take up. I just dabble just a teeny bit to be dangerous, maybe.
Sure. Okay, I'll be happy to put some stuff together for you.
Yeah, great. Yeah. But yeah, it's a great point that all conceptions of justice here aren't represented either. Thoughts, questions, or connections with your own experience with evaluation?
Leanne, I've of course got a ton of questions and whatnot, but I'm going to hold on to them. I'm actually going to pause the recording in case people want to perhaps ask a more pointed question, and or you want to give a more pointed answer perhaps. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit pause, and
that's great.
Hopefully, Teresa, I'll remember to turn it back on when you wrap it up here.
Great. Yeah, just thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation. I've dropped in the chat the link to my PowerPoint if anyone wants that. And yeah, thanks for coming today, and hopefully it gives you some new perspectives and things to think about with evaluation.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Good conversation. It's good to see folks. I know it's not the new year now that we're in February, but it's the new year for us, so it's good to see everybody in the new year.